Hi everyone, this is an instructional video about the point of view in the story Fish Cheeks. And we're going to kind of keep coming back to this story because there's a lot going on and I can use it for instruction and then you can practice in other ways. So this specifically has to do with point of view in the story. I'm trying to adjust here. Okay, so we can tell right away in this story that the point of view is from first person point of view. It's told from the character Amy's perspective. And we tell that right away here. I fell in love with the minister's son the winter I turned 14. Okay, but by the time that we are in high school, the standard that we're actually working on is to identify the point of view. So we have to do that, first person here. But we need to explain why an author used this point of view and what it does to the story. That's a much more complex question to deal with. And eventually we're going to work on how this gives the story a sense of irony. And we're not to irony yet. We will later in the week. But right now we're working on point of view. And so we really need to think through this story and why the author chose to use first person point of view here. And I always explain this to students with the question of this. If it was told from another person's point of view, how would the story be different? And in this case, the story would be really different, right? Like if you told it from the boy's perspective, Robert, you'd have a really different story. I think probably less interesting. I get the feeling in this story that Robert actually isn't interested in her that much. So it'd kind of be boring. He'd tell the story about, I went over to this family's house and it was a weird dinner. The end. Okay. Like I feel like that would be the story. And that's not what makes this story interesting. Like what makes this story interesting is the fact that this girl is kind of struggling with her identity because of this situation with this boy, right? And her family. And if we had it from the mom's point of view or the dad's point of view, but mainly the mom, because I think she's doing most of the cooking, you'd have a really different story too. And I think still kind of less interesting. It would still be okay, probably. Like it's interesting that this mom like cared so much for the daughter and was trying to make this good meal and her daughter kind of acted like a jerk the whole night. But the story wouldn't have that kind of surprise ending, right? Where she finds out later that her mom made all of her favorite foods. Like if the mom was telling the story, we'd kind of know that from the very beginning, probably. She'd be like, my daughter, we wanted to make this special Christmas dinner, so, we made all her favorite foods. We also probably wouldn't have the detail about the girl liking Robert and having a crush on her because I get the feeling that the mom doesn't really know that. And so it's the crush that kind of makes the story a little more interesting and complex. Okay. Now, if the author had told us this from third person point of view, like telling it from everyone's perspective and using she and he and those pronouns, we would have a really different story too. And I also think less interesting. Like if you knew what everybody was thinking throughout the story, there wouldn't be a lot of suspense in this story, right? Like you'd know if Robert liked her or not. Okay. And part of the thing that makes this story interesting is that we don't know what Robert thinks about her. So that gives it some suspense. If we knew what both the girl was thinking and what the parents were thinking, again, we would have less suspense, right? Because you'd kind of be in the know about what all the characters were thinking, and that wouldn't make a very interesting story. And then that part at the end wouldn't really be as dramatic because we would have known that the whole way through if it was in third person. Okay, so the author here is intentionally choosing a point of view to make the story more interesting. And in some ways, we also connect more emotionally by what the girl's saying than we would other characters. Okay, but it adds suspense to the story to just tell it from this person's perspective. Now, there are other stories that we'll read in this course where the author does use third person, and because of that, the story is actually more interesting. It's possible to write a really interesting story using third person because you get to know what everyone's thinking, but it wouldn't have worked for this story. Okay, so as you're thinking through point of view, you always need to think, well, how would the story be different if it was told from a different perspective? And that's what's going to help us kind of understand then what the author is actually trying to do in the story the way they told it. And then we can start to think, oh, yeah, well, that's why this story is suspenseful. And that's why this story is more interesting. And that's why the conflict is more interesting. Okay, so an author's choice of point of view is done really intentionally to give us a more interesting story. Okay, I hope that's helpful to you. And next, you're going to answer questions about what I just went over for this story.